Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the first lead off on the lecture series for Rodef Shalom Congregation, and specifically the Prayer Practice and Learning Project. And this was a brainchild from Salem Lehman and others, I'm sure, but something that he's promoted for some time now, and did a lot of work to organize this series. He's a member of the Prayer Practice Learning Committee. He was a co-chair and a treasured member of our congregation. And to start tonight, we have our featured speaker, Rich Brean, who's going to talk to us, tell us about the Jewish Hill District and the history of the Jewish Hill District and the heritage we have from that part of Pittsburgh. Just as an advertisement, this is a series that will be featured about monthly. We've got a wonderful lineup for you, including Eric Lidji, Matthew Falcone, Martha Berg, and perhaps others coming up through the series. So I very much appreciate all your participation tonight. Thank you so much for being with us. These are recorded and streamed. So if you want to be able to introduce them to other people that may not be with us exactly tonight, we can do that later on. And with no further ado, let me turn it over to Rich Brean. You may want to go to speaker view so that you can see Rich on Zoom. Okay, Rich, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Bill, very much. I'd like to start off this evening by apologizing. I'm going to be reading my talk. So I'm usually a pretty funny and spontaneous guy, and today I'll be sort of maybe didactic or passing along information to you. But there's so much of it, I really did want to get it in. In fact, there's so much of it. The second talk in this series, which is supposed to be the exodus from the Hill District, talking about the movement to East End, Stanton Heights, and Squirrel Hill, we're staying on the Hill, okay? Now, start it off. The Jewish Hill District was born in the early 1870s, and it died in 1960, a few years short of its 90th birthday. Every member of the first generation who remembered it is gone. Virtually every member of the second generation is also gone, and the few survivors are in their 90s. Few members of the third generation, the youngest of whom are baby boomers in their early 70s, have personal memories of the Jewish Hill District. And what they know about the Jewish Hill, they learned secondhand from stories told to them by their parents and grandparents. I'm blessed to be among those very few lucky members of the third generation who saw the Jewish Hill up close, which I did in its dying days, because I grew up in my parents' drugstore, J Drug, at the corner of Center and Roberts, and I lived in a house steeped in not just memories of the Hill, but current experiences. Before I begin my talk, I'd like to express the debt I owe to my wife, Karen, president of Temple, who is sitting right here. She served as my photographer, IT consultant, Zoom maven, typist, and editor. Without Karen, you'd now be home watching the World Series between the Rays and the Dodgers. I'd like to express my deepest thanks to Eric Lidji, the director of the Rauh Jewish Archives at the Heinz History Center, whose help and research suggestions made this talk possible. I'd now like to share with you very briefly my primary references in the hope that tonight's talk will pique your interest into learning more about the Jewish Hill. Ken Love's invaluable DVD entitled Jewish Memories of Pittsburgh's Hill District, which incorporates material from Dr. Barbara Burston's earlier DVD, A Jewish Legacy. Dr. Burston's two terrific reference books, which are available on her website, sophiemazloff.com. Steel City Jews, A History of Pittsburgh and its Jewish Community, 1840 to 1915, 2008, and Steel City Jews in Prosperity, Depression, and War, 1915 to 1950, 2015. Next, Images of America, Jewish Pittsburgh, edited by Dr. Burston and published by Arcadia Publishing in 2015. And finally, a really terrific 2016 work of fiction, About the Dybbuk's Jewish historical fiction from Pittsburgh's Hill District by Sue Lindenberg McClelland, which is available from Amazon. I read this book in one afternoon on the day before Rosh Hashanah. It was like my parents had never died. It's an extraordinary book. A number of people remember Sue. She was the daughter of Sidney Lindenberg, who was the last executive director of the Ikes. And she herself also lived in the dying days of the Jewish Hill, because she lived in the Ikes between 1947 and 1953, between the ages of 7 and 13. And this book is just extraordinary. It comes to life. Now, it's available on Amazon, and I really suggest you get it. Now, my talk tonight is broken into 4 topics. Topic 1, the geography and ethnography of the Hill District. Topic 2, a lightning quick history of the Jewish Hill. Topic 3, my exposure to the Jewish Hill. Topic 4, they were Jews. Now, my second talk on November 17th will cover 4 more topics. Topic 5, they were poor and they struggled. Topic 6, they worked and they organized. Topic 7, they learned. And topic 8, they became Americans. Now, before we get into the meat of the presentation, I'd like to warm you up with 2 vignettes about the Jewish Hill. The first vignette is about what I call the I know him from the Hill phenomenon. Now, the thing about Jews from the Hill was that they all knew each other, or at least claimed to have known each other. Now, I suspect it's because, for most of them, it's the link to other people who lived on the Hill that brought them psychologically back to what they saw as a special place, at least in hindsight. An excellent example of this phenomenon occurred in 1984 in Saul Kronzek's butcher shop on Bryant Street in Highland Park. It's now a trendy fern bar. When the newly married Karen and Rich Brean arrived to buy the first pound of kosher meat that would grace the kitchen of their new home on Leroy Road in Point Breeze, right across the street from Rabbi Jacob. First, some background facts. My father, Harry, was one of 8 Brean siblings who grew up on Reed Street near Center in the Upper Hill. 3 were girls, my aunts Mary, Rose, and Leona, and 5 were boys, my dad and my uncles Paul, Simon, Saul, and Louis, known in the family and on the Hill as Pacey, Cy, Shuli, and Lidji. We ordered a significant amount of beef and chicken. In those less health-conscious days, red meat was still served in our house. And Karen takes out our checkbook and asks Saul if he'll take a check. Saul looks for a few seconds at the check, which lists the account holders as Richard J. Brean and Karen Markison Brean. And then he says, not missing a beat, "It depends. Are you related to Lidji, Shuli, Cy, Pacey, or Harry?" Karen brightens and replies, "Harry, he's my father-in-law." And Saul deadpans, "Harry? Him, I'll take the check." Only then does he smile. What Saul was saying is, I know them all from the Hill, and you're welcome here. The second vignette? Second vignette concerns a phenomenon I call the selective amnesia that's produced overwhelming and mostly inexplicable nostalgia for the Hill among the second generation. For all those members of the third generation in Squirrel Hill, East End, and Stanton Heights, whose second generation parents grew up on the Hill, we knew a gusher of heavy, warm memories about the Hill was about to wash over us whenever we heard this phrase, quote, "We didn't know we were poor because everyone was poor." That's not true. Let me tell you the story. Here are the characters. They all come from different branches of my family, and they're all graduates of the Fifth Avenue High School class of 1933. My favorite uncle, Arnold Feinberg, and God, how we miss him, was married to Rose Brean. Arnold was one of the great figures of Hill District athletic history. He was inducted into the Jewish Sports Hall of Fame in second class in the early 1980s for his exploits as a basketball player at Fifth Avenue High School and the IKS, as the Pennsylvania State high jump champion. The other 2 participants, Gertie and Ruby Brogg, were from the other side of my family. Gertie, whose maiden name was Frischman, was sister of Anne Frischman, who married my mother's brother, Sam Gelman. Aunt Anne was my second mother. Ruby, who was built like a fire plug, was maybe the funniest and best-hearted man I ever knew. Gertie had a great sense of humor. It was a prerequisite for marriage to Ruby, but she was also a strong-willed, highly intelligent woman who had no time for nonsense. Both Gertie and Ruby were devout Orthodox Jews. 2 generations of Hillel students know Gertie as Mrs. Broad, the Hillel Academy secretary who actually ran the school. She did not suffer fools gladly. Gertie was the class secretary of the class of 33 at Fifth, the highest office a woman could hope to aspire to in those distant days. After the birth of our daughter Molly in 1991, we reconnected with Aunt Gertie and Uncle Ruby, and our daughter, from the age of 2, was delighted to go to their apartment in the Imperial House, where Ruby would entertain Molly by standing on his head at the age of 75. On one visit, I had the idea of reuniting Ruby and Gertie with their Fifth Avenue classmate Arnold, and they jumped at the opportunity to see him again after many, many years. What a night. Ruby and Arnold revisited their non-exploits of playing on the worst football team in Fifth Avenue in City League history, winless and scoreless. Next, they laughed their way through the tale about how Ruby, who loves to eat, went hungry after the team got home late on a Friday afternoon from a football game at Alderdice. Knowing that he had to be home before the Shabbos meal began, Ruby dashed through the streets of the Hill, in his own words, quote, to the family mansion on Clark Street, which, believe me, had no mansions, only to arrive after the brachas had been completed, and he was promptly shown to the door by his father, and he remained in the hall for the next hour and a half. All 3 howled at the 60-year-old memory of Gertie's refusal to do Arnold's homework, when she admonished him in homeroom, Arnold, honesty is the best policy, and besides, every other girl is already doing your homework. Then Arnold or Ruby, I can't remember which, uttered the fateful line, quote, we didn't know we were poor because everyone was poor. And Gertie replied, Richie, don't you believe that? We knew exactly how poor we were, and these 2 jokers sitting in front of you know all about all those good Jews who broke their hearts working on Shabbos just to pay the rent. The Hill only looks good to Jews because it had a happy ending. The Jews got off the Hill. It was a slum, and everybody left as soon as they had enough money in their pocket to get out. Now let's take a look at a slideshow of the Hill and see what Aunt Gertie was talking about.
I'm gonna do screen sharing.
Okay. Goes to the beginning here, 1 through 11.
Yeah, wait a second. Something's wrong here.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, let's go to the,
Okay, no problem.
let me go up to the top. There we go.
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, I think we are screen sharing.
Well, 1 second. Worked perfectly before, folks.
Okay,
Here we go.
Here we
Okay.
go. Wait a second, slideshow.
Okay.
Okay,
Now, here's a shot I think you've probably never seen before. This is looking westwards, an aerial shot of the Lower Hill District. We know the approximate date because Conley Vocational High School here was built in 1930, and the old Central High School, which you'll hear a lot in my next lecture, was torn down in 1946, so it's that 15-year period. You'll recognize a number of buildings. Here's the Coppers Building.
yeah, you wanna move your
Oh, Coppers Building right here, okay? The William Penn Hotel, the County Courthouse, City County Building, New County Building, okay? So it looks like a world we know, modern. Let's take a look here at the Lower Hill. We know this was torn down in the late 1950s for the Civic Arena. Look at it. I dare you to find a single tree. Find an open space, anyone except Washington Park with a concrete like mud, okay? There isn't even a grid of these streets. It's a warren like something out of old London, okay? And a place will know of just unrequited misery for the people who live there, despite the nostalgia now for it, okay? Next picture, please. Next one.
Yep.
Okay, now this is the hill and it's all its lack of majesty. This is taken from the top of the Grant building in probably the early 1930s. Here's a famous Jewish landmark. This is the Washington Shul. This is the Epiphany Church. This is the lower hill, down roughly in here. The middle hill behind it, the upper hill beyond it. This, by the way, would later be a project site. Again, look at this. It looks like Calcutta. The density, not a blade of grass virtually. Okay, next please. All right, this is taken around 1910. This is in the lower hill. And of course, the Hill District is also the mother earth of the Black community of Pittsburgh. And this was called Little Haiti at the time in the lower hill. And you see Black people and a girl probably Irish from the look of her. And you can see the privy. Really, until 1920, the lower hill had no indoor bathrooms. Next picture, please. Now here are Jews. This is a tenement off Webster Avenue. 15 families in the front, and by the way, 15 families beside, 30 of them. A good rent roll. How'd you like to live there? Next. Okay, now here's a picture we're used to seeing. We all know as Pittsburgh Jews the sainted story of the Irene Kaufman settlement, the Ikes as it was called, and we still call it that when we grew up in Squirrel Hill. Now this is a nurse from the visiting nurse service, the Angels of the Hill they were called, visiting an elderly Jewish woman in her tenement on the hill. Okay, now that's what we see this. Next slide, please, Kara. Okay, here's the background. This is the visiting nurse service of the Irene Kaufman settlement. Here's what it says. Irene Kaufman settlement, nursing service 1920, where the call came from. This is where Jews lived in the Hill District in 1920, not in 1890, although it looks like Jacob reshot the Lower East Side from then. This is 1920 in the Hill. That's the year my mother came here from Paris after they had fled from Bessarabia and waited to get into America. Next scene, please. Okay, now also a visiting nurse. It's no longer 1920. This is probably the mid-1930s. This strong, proud Jewish woman with a medical bag that said she was a visiting nurse service of Ikes. Okay, now look behind if we can. Look at this. Okay, that's what the hill looked like. That house. Okay, next please. All right, here we are again. Now this again is not a picture from the Lower East Side of 1888. Look at this landmark. That's the Golf Building. That was finished in 1932. This is taken in the 30s where Jews lived on the hill. Next picture, please. All right, again, the Grant Building, finished in 1929. This is also where Jews lived in the 20s and 30s on the hill. Remember what Gertie said. Next, please. More of the 30s on the hill. Next. The final picture. We all know about the Ikes and the milk well and Henry Kaufman and the teaching about good nutrition and bringing milk to the hill for free for all the Jewish kids. Now, this year is not the Depression, it's 1927. As you look at those little faces, that could be like one of those, the great Vishnak, the great photographs in the Warsaw Ghetto, what kids looked in Eastern Europe, the same faces. This is 1927. You know why they're getting milk? Because of malnutrition. In the good times of 1927, not in the Depression. Okay, end of slideshow. Right. So maybe Gertie had something. Now, here our next topic is the geography and ethnography of the Jewish Hill District, which I think you have to know about to make any sense of what's really going on. This is the context. Can you put up slide 12 here?
Sure.
Okay. Oh, the other way, I think, yeah.
Yep. Up, hold on a sec.
Okay, sure, no problem.
Going back and forth.
Mhm. Here it is. Okay.
Wait a minute. We have to switch.
Oh, here we are. Okay.
We have to go back to screen sharing.
Okay. All right.
Sorry,
Now,
we're not there yet.
okay.
Sorry. I'm trying to get it to screen share again. It's
Okay.
not working.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Okay.
Not quite sure why. Unclear.
Maybe we don't.
Unclear
Maybe,
what's happening.
maybe we'll dispense with the map. That's okay.
No,
I think you've
but
got
we
it. I think you've got it. What are you pressing? You're pressing the screen share button, and then the thing comes up with the different.
Yeah, there it is, yeah.
Can you see it?
Nope. But just walk me through what you're doing. Let's get those pictures. The pictures are incredible. That's a
But
really good collection.
Somehow I'm not back on Zoom with you guys. That's what's weird.
Am I on Zoom?
Yeah, we see you. We're talking with you.
Okay.
This is very weird because I don't see you now.
Well,
on
if
our
you
screen.
could see this map, it's quite something.
Because you're not screen sharing it right now.
Yeah.
But if you come down to the bottom row, right, of your computer screen, you'll see all the different icons.
Yeah, and I see a Zoom icon, and it's telling me to join the meeting. I mean, it's like I'm out of Zoom. I don't know.
No, you're still here.
Okay, well,
Yeah, Zoom comes up with two windows
Okay.
for some cryptic reason that is very confusing.
Okay.
One of them being the Zoom room proper, and the other one being something where you could sign into Zoom.
Yeah.
So you want the other Zoom.
Okay. I'm right clicking. I'm not getting there. I'm sorry. Taking
Okay,
Rich's time here,
it's okay. I mean, honestly, Karen, don't worry.
but
You click Alt and Tab at the same time. It'll scroll through your windows that you have open. This is a fun fact for everybody who wants to use their computer a little better. Is and Tab together will scroll through the different applications you have open, and one of those will eventually get you back to Zoom. Are you back?
okay. I see you up here. I see you in my window, and I'm not getting the screen sharing icon.
No.
You don't see it at the bottom, the Zoom options. It's on the same bar where you have mute and then stop video.
Rich, I'm sorry.
What's okay, Karen? Honestly, don't worry.
Take your time. You've put together a really incredible presentation. We want to see the whole thing.
So I'm not getting Zoom back. It's so weird.
Well, should we continue or try
Yeah,
to?
I guess.
Yeah.
Why don't you start talking?
Radio's always better. But
You start talking while I try to
if
solve
you,
it.
if you could see this map of the Hill District, it says the Hill District of Pittsburgh, and it's a superb map of the Hill. And what it is a police map showing the location of gambling dens in the Hill and labels them Negro and white. But that shows the grid very well. But here's how we'll start. Okay. We'll start by tracing the boundaries of the Hill. The southern border of the Hill starts at the corner of 5th and Wyandotte Street. That's where Jubilee Kitchen and the Heinz Children's Center are now. Now, to the east of this, on 5th Avenue, on the hills above it and the streets below, is Soho. Now, that is the edge, the eastern edge of the hill. Soho is dominated by Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and Russians, Christian immigrants from the same Russian Empire from which the Jews fled. Now, the southern border runs along 5th Avenue through the old wholesale district known throughout Western Pennsylvania as Jewtown. Those are not politically correct days, and reaching downtown at Tunnel Street. Now, south of 5th Avenue, running parallel between 5th Avenue and the Boulevard of the Allies, is another neighborhood, the Bluff, which hosted a few Jewish families, but was mostly Irish and very tough. Now, Tunnel Street was the western border of the hill. It's long gone. It followed the path of an old tunnel carrying the canal boats of the Pennsylvania Canal into downtown. Its path paralleled current Rauh Street. The hill began literally across the street, the Allegheny County Courthouse, and the current Doubletree Hotel, Bigelow Square, would have been square in the middle of the lower hill. Now, the northern border of the hill ran along Cliff Street, on top of the steep hill on which Grant Boulevard, now Bigelow Boulevard, was midway, and the Strip was at the bottom. The eastern border was Heron Avenue, a few blocks above the intersection of Heron and Bigelow, where the Jewish Hill touched Polish Hill. It then continued along Robinson Street up to Terrace Street, where the world of the West Oakland Irish began. No Hill District Jew considered Heron Hill to be part of the Jewish Hill. It had only one small shul, which at one point quickly decamped back to the hill. It was filled with Scots-Irish and Irish.
You actually do have the map up now, in case you want to show
Oh.
anything. Sorry.
Oh, folks,
It only took me an hour to do.
this is Fifth Avenue, Tunnel Street, Cliff Street. We're now right here, and we're going to be climbing up along the western end past Terrace Street. We've already here on the east. Now, the Jewish Hill, and in fact the hill in general, is divided into three distinct neighborhoods. There's the lower hill, which is really then between Tunnel Street and Crawford Street. The middle hill, which is Crawford, down to Kirkpatrick, which is here, and the upper hill is Kirkpatrick. So upper hill, middle hill, lower hill. Now, the lower hill is closest to downtown, and the good landmark identifying the Crawford Street, its eastern edge, is St. Bridget the Moor Church, which is still there. Now, virtually the entirety of the lower hill was torn down in the 1950s. This is the lower hill right here on the bottom. Oops, well,
Here it is.
oh, yeah, back again, okay. For the Crosstown Boulevard and the Civic Arena. The only buildings left of any significance are Epiphany Church at the corner of Washington Place and Center Avenue, and the old Connolly Vocational High School. Now, the portion of the lower hill closest to downtown was heavily Irish and Syrian, the term that Pittsburghers wrongly used to describe Maronite Christians from Lebanon. The Italians predominated around Washington Street and Bedford Avenue, and the Jews dominated the rest of the lower hill. Even before Blacks began arriving in numbers after 1810, substantial numbers of Jews had already migrated to the middle hill, and some of the more prosperous Jews had already decamped to Oakland and the East End. The lower hill contained the stomach of the Hill District, Logan Street, an extraordinary blend of bakeries, fruit stores, butcher shops, fish markets, and grocers. The lower hill also contained a number of Orthodox shuls, including the grand structures of Beth Medrash Haggadol and Shara Torah. The lower hill was a confusing jumble of streets laid out in the early 1800s. The residences were third-rate worker housing, mostly 2- to 3-story tenements built to house the early English, Scots, Irish, and German workforce of Pittsburgh's factories. Perhaps half the homes were made of wood. Until 1920, virtually all homes lacked bathrooms and showers. By 1925, the lower hill was majority Black, but until it was torn down in the mid-50s, it contained significant numbers of Italians and Syrians. Following that demolition, Blacks moved further up the hill and out to Homewood, Italians to Brookline and Penn Hills, and the Syrians to Beachview and Banksville. The middle hill was heavily Jewish by 1915 and slowly became a majority Black by 1930, with the two groups living side by side. My mother, from the time her family immigrated to Pittsburgh in 1920 until the time she married my father and moved to Oakland in 1938, lived every day of her life in a building which she had both Jews and African Americans as neighbors. Housing in the Middle Hill dated to the 1850s, with most residences being constructed prior to 1880. The houses were mostly 3-story federal type style detached houses built of brick, cut up into multiple apartments with families frequently sharing a floor and often bringing in roomers. The neighborhood had also been built for non-Jewish workers and had once been predominantly Scots-Irish, German, and Irish. In contrast to the Warren streets of the lower hill, the middle hill followed a grid with 4 broad east-west arteries: Center, Wiley, Webster, and Bedford avenues, intersected by north-south cross streets. The once solid brick homes of the middle hill had greatly deteriorated by the time the Jews arrived, and most houses suffered from overcrowding and poor maintenance. The middle hill started at the intersection of Crawford with Center, Wiley, Webster, and Bedford avenues, and ended with their intersection with Kirkpatrick Street. Kirkpatrick is a street running today down the hill to the Birmingham Bridge. When people today think of the Jewish Hill District, they invariably think not of the lower hill, but of the middle hill, which contained the IKS, the Hebrew Institute, most of the public schools attended by Jews, including Fifth Avenue High School, the Wiley Avenue Carnegie Library, and the Labor Lyceum. The showcase of the hill was Dinwiddie Street, of the middle hill was Dinwiddie Street, the home of the elite of the Eastern European Jews, especially doctors and lawyers. The architecture was something out of an Edith Wharton novel, breathtaking brownstones and white stones, a few of which still survive. My mother lived in the middle hill, first on Webster Avenue and then on Robert Street near Reed Street. In fact, in the very same house that our former mayor Sophie Masloff lived in, which was featured in Ken Love's DVD on the Hill. Sophie's family, the Friedmans, lived on the first floor and the Gelmans on the second. The upper hill ran along the 4 avenues from Kirkpatrick Street to Heron Avenue. The houses were the same federal style as the middle hill and suffered from the same overcrowding and poor maintenance. However, the upper hill was extremely hilly with a good deal of unbuildable land, and wooded hillsides were almost always in sight. To an extent, the upper hill had an almost rural aspect. On Reed Street, for example, an open pasture was across the street from the Brean house, and many families kept cows, including a commercial dairy herd owned by the Horowitz family, which later owned Horowitz Motors, the leading Chrysler Plymouth dealer of Squirrel Hill at Forbes and Murray. In his 1968 memoir, Dr. M.R. Goldman remembered the upper hill as being populated, in addition to Jews, by Scots-Irish, Irish, and Welsh families. The Welsh came as miners after 1875 to work in the coal mines that ran under the upper hill, which is thoroughly undermined to this day, which is why the enormous hillside running down Fifth Avenue from Robinson Street to the Birmingham Bridge still stands mostly empty. Several Welsh families lived near the Breens on Reed Street, and Bobby Brean remembered them as, quote, lovely people, and remembered well those hallmarks of working class Welsh culture, the bell ringing choruses and the lace making. She also appreciated the fact that they were, quote, Methodists who did not hate Jews, as opposed to the peasants in Ukraine who threw rocks at her when she was a girl, bringing the family's 2 cows to drink at the village spring. Now Hill District ethnography. Like my grandmother, Hill District Jews rated the various ethnic groups they encountered by the degree of their anti-Semitism or lack thereof. African Americans ranked high in Jews' esteem because they regarded Jews as people of the Bible and had no history of ingrained anti-Semitism like that brought from Europe by many white Christians. The Irish, the Poles of both the Hill and the neighboring Polish Hill, where my Zadie was hit by a brick on his wagon, and the Christian Eastern Europeans of Soho were regarded as Jew haters of the first order. The sole white group, which was held in high esteem because it was not anti-Semitic, were the Italians, who the Jews saw as an entirely distinct and special group, and they had 2 Yiddish terms for them. The polite term Talaners meant simply Italians, and the colloquial Lukshin or Luksh is what they were generally referred to. Where did Lukshin come from? Well, they're the Yiddish terms for noodle. It's because of the universality of pasta eating. After all, what's a lasagna but a noodle cooked with tomatoes and meat, right? Jews likened the Italian family structure to their own and insisted that their individual warmth as people meant they were, you put so many times, quote, just like the Jews. For example, my Uncle Sam Gelman's best friend for his entire life was Jimmy Sassano, an Italian barber who lived near Sam at the corner of Reed and Roberts. He considered Jimmy to be his brother. Jimmy's shop was on Center Avenue near Miller Street, and it was filled with every Saturday in the 1950s and early 1960s with Jewish customers. The perceived difference between the Irish and other Christians, in this case the Irish, is captured in this quote from Ziggy Khan, the famed athletic director of the IKS, as reproduced in Dr. Burston's book, Steel City Jews, 1840 to 1915, page 332, where Ziggy dispenses this wisdom that the manly art of boxing is the best defense against the resurrection by Irish kids of the medieval charge of blood libel. Here's Ziggy, quote, "It was very important that we learn how to defend ourselves. The Italian kids were our friends, but the Irish kids on the hill would accuse the Jews of putting blood in the matzahs. We had to fight, period. Knowing how to box was vital." Okay, now topic 2, a lightning quick history of the Jewish Hill. The first Jews in the hill were Lithuanians, who arrived in the 1870s in the Lower Hill. In 1881, following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, a wave of pogroms broke out, and Jews arrived on the hill from all parts of the Russian Empire, Lithuania, Poland, White Russia, and Ukraine. Jews also came to America as a result of growing anti-Semitism in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, particularly Galicia, which is part of Poland and Hungary. Jews continued to flood into the hill from the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires, and they were joined after 1900 by large numbers of Romanian Jews. By 1907, the Jewish population of Pittsburgh, most of which lived in the hill, was 25,000. By 1912, it expanded to 35,000. By 1917, it reached 40,000, and by 1920, 50,000. By 1920, the Jews were the dominant group in both the lower and upper and middle hill, and were spreading rapidly throughout the upper hill. A wave of synagogue buildings started in 1885, which we dealt with in detail in topic 4. The first great synagogue of note was the Beth Hamedrash Hagadol, which was founded in 1880 and built its magnificent Hill District Shul in 1892 on Washington Street. The last major synagogue constructed in the hill was Kesser Torah, which was built in 1920, the corner of Wiley Avenue and Aaron Street. A panoply of Jewish institutions were established in the hill after 1900. Especially noteworthy among them were the Monafire Hospital in 1908, the Irene Kaufman settlement at 1835 Center Avenue on the site of the earlier Columbian Council settlement, which opened in 1915, and the Hebrew Institute, which was founded in 1916 and opened its new building on Wiley Avenue in 1920. The Roaring 20s were prosperous times for America and for a significant portion of Hill District Jews. Jewish merchants, but not workers, were leaving the hill in increasing numbers all through the 1920s, with Squirrel Hill being the preferred destination, but Oakland and East End attracting the less affluent. In 1928, Miller School, not just my mother's alma mater, but exactly when my mother attended, still had the greatest number of Jews of any elementary school in the Pittsburgh Public Schools, with 728 students. But Colfax, an affluent part of Squirrel Hill, was a close second with 708. A fascinating insight is provided by these statistics, in that at the time my mother was living in dire poverty and attending Miller School, along with 727 other Jewish students, also in dire poverty, an almost equal number of Jewish children are living very comfortably in the brand new housing of Squirrel Hill. The number of Jewish students in the Hill District dropped from 4,000 precipitously in the 20s, from 4,119 in 1924 to 2,796 in 1928. On November 16, 1928, the Jewish Criterion, the newspaper of upper class Jews in Pittsburgh, as opposed to the Jewish Outlook, which was the lower class Jews, German versus Eastern European, published a story stating, quote, "The Hill District, as far as Jews are concerned, is through," end of quote. In 1929, Polizzetti becomes the first major shul to close its doors, and it moves to its present location on Phillips Avenue in Squirrel Hill. Also in 1929, Monafire Hospital leaves the Hill and moves to its current location in Oakland. With the Depression, the exodus of Jews from the Hill noticeably slowed, but they continued to leave for Oakland, East End, and Squirrel Hill. By 1940, Jewish enrollment in the Hill District schools was now down to 1,173 students. With Pittsburgh's economic boom during World War II, the movement of Jews to the Hill accelerated once again, and by 1949, only 167 Jewish pupils remained in Hill District schools. Interestingly, Jewish institutions remained on the Hill far longer than the Jewish population. Hebrew Institute stayed on Wally Avenue until 1944, when it moved to the corner of Denniston and Forbes and Squirrel Hill. In 1940, 16 of Pittsburgh's 33 synagogues are still on the Hill, but by 1957, only the Washington Shul was left. It's quite a list of losses. Sheret Tefillah closes on Noah Street in 1945 and moves to Bartlett Street in Squirrel Hill. Knesset Israel, also on Noah Street, closes in 1946 and moves to North Negley Avenue in East End. Sheret Torah closes on Townsend Street in 1948. Holds services and rented facilities in Squirrel Hill for the next 4 years and moves into its brand new beautiful shul on Murray Avenue in 1952. Sheret Zedek also closes on Townsend Street in 1948 and moves to Bartlett Street in Squirrel Hill. The synagogue closings continued into the 1950s. Mashakeh Hadass closes on Wiley Avenue and moves to North Negley Avenue in the East End in 1953. New Light closes on Robert Street in 1955. It opened its new synagogue on Beechwood Boulevard in Squirrel Hill in 1957. Finally, Kesset Torah closes at Webster and Aaron in 1957 and also moves to Bartlett Street. By the mid-1950s, the IKS was serving an almost exclusively African-American clientele. In 1956, it sold for $1 the entire complex to the Anna B. Heldman Center, an African-American institution. All IKC programming is moved to Squirrel Hill, other than the visiting nurse service, which IKS and the Jewish community continue to support financially for a number of years. In 1960, following a fire, the magnificent Washington Shul building was demolished. Even absent the fire, the building was doomed because it was going to be taken by the URA for demolition as part of the rerouting by the clearing of the Lower Hill District and the rerouting of Caldwell Street. With the closing of the Ikes in 1956 and the demolition of the Washington Shul, I contend that the Jewish Hill District died in 1960 because, while a small remnant population of Jews still resided in the Hill and Jewish merchants continued to be present, all Jewish communal life had ceased. Next, topic 3, my exposure to the Jewish Hill District. My father's drugstore, J Drug, was located at 181 Center Avenue in the Middle Hill, and hopefully we'll get the next slide, slide 13. Yes, here it is. I'm delighted to see it. Now, this is not the J Drug I remember. This was the earlier J Drug, with a magnificent, you'll see gilt lettering there, the old style sign of the drugs, et cetera, et cetera. This drugstore disappears in the early 1950s when Fireman's Department Store here opens a drugstore here, the bane of my father's life, with a brand new drugstore. It looks like it's in Monroeville. And my father begins to lose business. And he loved this front, and a lot of people with any artistic sense did too. But we ended up with a suburban looking front all as well. And I won't go into the long story behind that story. But this, you'll hear about these storefronts here. Fireman's Department Store. Here is the beloved Filner's Bakery. And above all, here is live fish. You know it is Bankovitz. It grew, like, can't say a cancer, I would say it grew organically along Center Avenue. Storeroom after storeroom after storeroom. And you'll remember, of course, this is where every Jewish woman in Squirrel Hill came to get fish for the Shabbos of the holidays. We'll talk about it later. Okay, now the name J Drug was given to the store by J. Hirsch, a pharmacist who bought the store in 1936 or 1937 and hired my father in 1938, the year my parents were married. As a matter of Rodef Shalom interest, I want to point out that Abe Littman, the father of Tim Littman, our Brotherhood president, worked at the store for a number of years before Jay bought it and would ultimately be thwarted in his attempts to permanently own it. My father became partners with Jay during World War II and bought out Jay's interest in 1946, with Jay moving on to open the Murray Avenue Pharmacy at Murray and Lilac in Greenfield. I first started working at the store at the candy counter in 1958 as a fourth grader at John Minadeo School. And my last day at the store was in January 1967, when I was home on winter break as a freshman at Kenyon College. And that day I worked at both the candy counter and the soda fountain. The store was a fully integrated enterprise with a workforce consisting solely of African Americans and members of our family. Apart from my father, Blacks held all positions of authority. Both pharmacists were African Americans, Bob Williams and English Webb, as were the two fountain managers, Lucille Brown and Viola Lewis. The soda fountain workers, in addition to me, were an assortment of Black high school students from Fifth Avenue and Shenley High, and members of our family, my brother Bob, whose endless shifts helped keep the store afloat, and our cousins, Shep and Larry Gelman. The most memorable of my co-workers was Linda Jean Kittle, the sister of August Wilson, who I had worked with for 4 years, a truly lovely and gentle soul. Beginning in 1965, as the store was failing, our mother began working at the fountain 5 days a week, and without her, the store would have closed a year earlier than it did. When my father started working at the store in 1938, most of the customers and employees were Jewish. But by the time I arrived in 1958, all the employees were Black, as were most of the customers. However, one employee, our porter, Al White, a retired Black steelworker, bridged the two cultures in the store by dint of his ability to speak basic Yiddish, albeit with a pronounced Galicianer accent, which he had picked up as a teenager working in a summer job loading seltzer trucks on Bedford Avenue when he worked with an old Jew and had to learn Yiddish because the old man's English was so bad. Although J Drug was a mostly Black world, Jews were in and out of the store all day long, mostly sitting at our fountain eating ice cream or drinking the best milkshakes on the hill. They were an incredibly diverse bunch, and the only thing they had in common is they were all Jews. I spent hundreds of hours listening to them talk. Salesmen from Jewish-owned drug companies, Federal Rice, Shipley, and Linco, delivery drivers from Jewish-owned United Baking, Lipsitz Candy and Tobacco, Tom Tucker Pop, and Phillips Stein Wholesale Grocers, including my mother's brother, Max Gelman, saleswomen from Fireman's Department Store, bottlers and drivers from the strictly Orthodox Anchor Pop Company on Robert Street, which provided every bottle of pop ever drunk by an Orthodox shul in Pittsburgh. Merchants and clerks from all the surrounding stores. The favorite of both me and my father was Sarah Filner, who owned Filner's Bakery across the street and always brought thumbprint cookies as a gift. She was also a leftist and a rabid union supporter, and was proud of the fact that her shop was under contract with Local 44 of the Hebrew Bakers Union, which you'll learn about next month in my talk. Everything in the shop had a union label. Fortunately, with the cakes, the label was on the box, not the icing. A huge contingent from the live fish company across the street, the biggest employer in the Hill, including owner Bernie Bankovitz, who came en masse for milkshakes, kidding each other and everyone else at the fountain about the fish smell they brought into the store. Women shopping at live fish for Shabbos stopped in always. Next, customers who either lived on the Hill or took the trouble to drive to the store from their homes in Squirrel Hill or Stanton Heights to pick up their prescriptions because, quote, just wanted to come down to the Hill. On Saturday afternoon, we welcomed a sizable group of self-described loafers, Jewish men, including my Uncle Sam Gelman, whose idea of a perfect Shabbos afternoon was to come down from Squirrel Hill to Center Avenue to while away the hours at Jimmy Susano's barbershop, Whitey's restaurant, and the J Drug fountain. Unlike the weekday Jews, who were anchored in the day-to-day world of the till that still actually existed, they talked about almost exclusively about growing up in the Hill District, They sounded just like Uncle Arnold and Uncle Ruby before Gertie shut down the conversation. Another source of invaluable input as to what the Jewish Hill District was like were virtually years of talking about the Hill with two men who I loved very much. The first was my Uncle Max, who I consider as my second father, who was sunshine turned into a man. He delivered for the Phillips Company all over the Hill, and I would ride with him on his route, right next to the no rider sticker on his big Brockway truck. The second was my father's best friend, Matey Leff, who I called Uncle Matey, who owned a garage on Rose Street in the Hill. He was a free thinker who had the same thirst for social justice as my father, but had moved far away from my father's modern orthodoxy. When he died, his wife, Aunt Grace, and their son, Alan, scattered his ashes on Rose Street where the garage had stood. Matey never left the Hill. The best way for you to understand the Jewish Hill is for me to describe to you what these Jews were like, based on years of what a sociology professor would call field work.
You might want to tell people that there'll be time for questions and
Oh,
they can start thinking about it.
Oh, yeah. So there'll be questions at the end. Please think about it. Or reminiscences too. First, they regarded the Hill District as their home. They were perfectly comfortable being there. Second, they had an incredible warmth towards each other. It seemed that being on the Hill, as opposed to being from the Hill, triggered sincere solicitude. Conversations, which always began with kibitzing, usually turned into totally serious inquiries about each other's health and families. Third, because they grew up on the Hill, African Americans had always been part of their lives. And even when they were greatly outnumbered by Black people, these Jews exhibited none of the fear, anxiety, and disorientation that most whites typically exhibit in such circumstances. Fourth, with very few exceptions, they judged Blacks as individuals because that's how they encountered and interacted with them since they were children. In their world, Black people had names and faces. Fifth, through their own experiences with anti-Semitism and the continuing shock produced by their constant awareness of the Holocaust, they saw Jews as victims. And they easily made the transition to also seeing Blacks as victims. It was based on their experience of seeing with their own eyes how miserably Blacks have been treated, both on the Hill and in America, not just in the past, but continuing to that very day when they were sitting at the counter. Sixth, they had a particular sense of sympathy for Blacks, rooted in their realization that both had suffered from discrimination while growing up on the Hill, but that the doors that opened for the Jews and let them escape to a better life remained firmly barred to Blacks, who were all still trapped on the Hill. I'm certain there were some in that group whose racial attitudes were less than perfect and would even qualify as racist, but they kept their attitudes to themselves. They would not have been welcome to express them. I'm also certain it would be impossible to find a random group of white people of similar education and income during the period 1958 through 1967 who have expressed these attitudes that I witnessed year after year at J. Drug. In short, if you were a Jew who grew up in the Hill and still had frequent contact with the Hill during the years I worked at the drugstore, you were a pretty good person. In fact, you were a mensch. I'd like to give you an example of these particular attitudes among Hill District Jews. That of my father, who was born in Ukraine in 1905, immigrated to Rauh Street with his family in 1910, and worked on the Hill as a pharmacist from 1928 until the day J. Drug closed in March 1967. My friend Chuck Fax always called my father the last angry man because he reminded Chuck of that character played by Paul Muni in the movie of the same name, an idealistic Jewish doctor eking out a living in a Black slum in Brooklyn, where he perpetually rages against the injustices meted out every day to his African-American patients. As we lawyers say, Chuck's description is largely on point, but for complete accuracy, you would have to add to the rage of the Brooklyn doctor my father's lifelong frustration because he was denied the opportunity to even attend medical school, because in the penniless Brean household, medical school was simply out of the question. He felt as a pharmacist, he was able to use only a small portion of his talents to help people. Hill District Jews instinctively supported the underdog. And my father was cut from the very exact same cloth. My brother Bob and I used to joke that whenever our father sat down to watch a college football game, the first words out of his mouth were always, "Who's the underdog?" In the early 1960s, there was no question that Pittsburgh's blacks as a class were the underdog. And the NAACP, in conjunction with black community groups, started long overdue boycotts against firms that refused to hire African Americans. Among the worst offenders were the major soft drink companies, Coke, Pepsi, and 7-Up, which were happy to sell their products on the Hill, but which refused to hire blacks, either drivers or bottling plant workers. As a consequence, a citywide boycott was launched against all three companies. The only company to escape the boycott was Jewish-owned Tom Tucker, which employed a goodly number of blacks. My father enthusiastically endorsed the boycott. He instructed Coke, Pepsi, and 7-Up to remove their products from J-Drug and to stop all future deliveries. He then went one step further. He disconnected the Coke machine, the number one moneymaker in a drugstore that was failing as the discounters cut our throat. And then White Cross, a point of information, for example, White Cross, the big discounter, was selling Alka-Seltzer at retail for 10 cents less a bottle. My father was paying wholesale. As the boycott dragged on and our losses from the embargoed Coke machine piled up, I approached my father, future attorney that I was, with a lawyerly argument that the express terms of the boycott didn't include fountain Cokes because the syrup was made by a different division of the Coca-Cola company. And I then added the practical argument that I was certain our black customers would support turning on the machine because everyone was asking for Cokes all day long and we were losing a fortune. You'll be astonished, by the way, at the markup on fountain sodas that kept McDonald's in the black for years. My father looked me in the eye, and his response has never left me. His word choice reflecting the early 60s, quote, "It's terrible to be a Jew, but it's 10 times worse to be a Negro. They're not even treated like human beings, and I can assure you that they are human beings. Do you think Lucille's not a human being?" And then he said, "Why are you making up arguments? They're just excuses to hurt people." Chuck was right. The last angry man.
We can do a time check that I wonder if we should take some questions and maybe put this section in the next talk.
Oh, okay. How much time? Where are we?
It's about 10 after 8 now.
Oh, yes. Karen was suggesting that what we should probably do is maybe move the next section into my next speech,
Yeah, I
and
think-
now allow time for questions and comments.
Yeah,
And
I think so.
yeah, great. So we'll end with my father.
Well, I don't mean to.
Yeah,
push
no,
you, but
absolutely.
I think.
Right.
think
No,
if
I
we could-
agree. I agree.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, now how do we?
So we can stop screen sharing.
Right.
Okay, and we're seeing everybody on Zoom,
Wonderful.
and we can.
Is there a chat
ask-
function, or how do we know where the
Well,
questions come
I
in?
guess what we could do is say, speak up, and then we'll see the bar around it and we'll call on
Yeah,
anybody who wants to
And I
talk.
guess we have different screens too. Well,
Yeah,
we're ready for comments, questions, criticism.
See one question in the chat from
Yep.
Pamela, asking about your references again. About your key things that you used for your research.
the references.
Oh,
that you
yes,
have in here.
right.
I'll flip to them for you.
Yes, about the, what about them, Olivia? To repeat some or to ask, what did I find valuable or what?
Do you keep-
Pamela, if you're here, you can ask your question out loud. You can come off of mute.
If you could just repeat them, please, especially the last one. I didn't get the
Yeah,
last.
it's written, the author is Sue Lindenberg McClelland. The
Okay,
title is About the Dibbicks,
okay.
Jewish historical fiction from Pittsburgh's Hill District. I think it's $12.95 on Amazon. So it's a
Thank
quick
you.
read, about 160 pages.
Okay, thank you very much.
Did I just say something here?
And Terry?
Oh, I was just going to tell you that Bart said that he remembers his father telling him that when he was young, he visited his grandfather who lived on Miltonberger Street.
Oh, absolutely, right. That's right where the bluff meets the hill.
Okay, I'd like to
That's
ask,
Fifth Avenue High
comment,
School.
if I could, Rich, about the Irene Kaufman settlement. Samuel Rosenberg, the artist, came
Right.
to Pittsburgh from Philadelphia in 1921 to work at the Irene Kaufman settlement. and he started to document the hill, the markets, some of his earlier pictures when he was painting,
realist. It was still a realist. Yes,
he was still a realist. Okay, like he painted well, a lot of these are in the book, the Pittsburgh book about Pittsburgh.
Right. Yeah, the whole we're talking about Rosenberg is it's part of they became Americans.
Okay.
In the IKS.
Yeah. Well, obviously he became really one of the most notorious painters of Pittsburgh scene. Like them when they were building Baum Boulevard, he has a painting that he did of.
Absolutely.
No, not Baum, Bigelow Boulevard,
right.
And Conley Trade School up on the hill. Anyhow,
they're very, for people listening, and they're very socially conscious painting. Rosenberg was certainly left sympathetic, and he will paint the Jews of the Hill District, very much the suffering of blacks in the Hill District, and he was fascinated by Soho and the mixture there. And they're very vivid landscapes in Soho. And interestingly, the one famous person from Soho is Andy Warhol.
And Andy Warhol was one of his students at Carnegie Mellon,
right,
and Carnegie Tech, and they wanted to throw him out of school, but Uncle Sam said, no, this man has some talent, and he kept him in the school. Andy Warhol.
Right. Yeah, and to give a sense of people what's coming, they were Jews, which follows, of course, the synagogues and developments, but you'll be able to see, as part of that, the fragments of Jewish life that have survived, that there are 4 or 5 shuls that are now, are still in the Hill District, the buildings. And it's really quite stunning. For example, Knesset Israel, which still stands at Miller and Caldwell, was at first a Mormon church. It had been built by Mormon converts in the 19th century. It becomes a shul. It was a beautiful stained glass window with the Mogen David. Ultimately, a Black Baptist church. It now stands abandoned. Again, Knesset Israel is nothing remarkable in terms of Jewish history or the building, but Sheret Tefillah, which is further up Miller Street, opposite Miller School, was one of the major shuls of the Hill. It's a Greek revival building of great beauty. Eric Lidji, it's now abandoned. It was the Miller Street Baptist Church. It's empty. There's a big sign in front by Sotheby's, the fancy realtor. And already that the Labor Lyceum next door, the Jewish Union Hall, was torn down for condominiums. And this is clearly next. And it's just a tragedy. Eric Lidji, who's the director of the Rauh Jewish Archives, has been inside. He said the women's section is in mint condition. It's recognizably a shul. You can see where the ark was, where the bima was, the arrangements, everything else, stained glass windows as well.
Wow.
And, I really find, the various priorities of the UGF it's all vital. And I know that everyone's hard pressed, but good grief, the notion that this thing could be torn down. And this is where again, another quick story. Zadie Breen belonged there for a while. Oh.
My podcast just came on.
Oh, sorry, his podcast came on. Well, might bury that in your water there. Well, with the money that we, you can.
I don't know.
Maybe take it. Well, at any rate, with the UGF and all the rest, the notion of losing this shul where my grandfather belonged, and it's fantastic. The top of it says Beth David. Okay. And when you read deeply the Sheret Tefillah, why does it say Beth David? Because who knew how many breakaways, mergers, intersections, fights had involved in this building? And Sheret Tefillah was the thing that finally survived when a number of feuding congregations would merge into it. And my grandfather quit in a huff. Who knows why? Like they all quit in a huff. Okay. And the notion it's sitting there and that we would lose it and probably lose it in a hurry. And I don't know what it costs. We're talking $1 million, $2 million, $2.5 million to restore it. In Washington, they have this shul called Sixth and I, which has become this for the entire city. And we knew a dream would be to use that. And again, it's not, the hill around it is reviving. It's in Crawford Roberts. There are significant, beautiful homes nearby. I mean, it'd be a crime if that were to go. That's my, any more questions or more questions? I see Nancy Rosenthal, I think.
No, this is Bob Rosenthal.
Oh, Bob, right.
We'll be again. Hey, you'll have to, I hope I'm not duplicating a discussion here because I had to go away for a phone call for a few minutes. But the Labor Lyceum has always been fascinating to me. Do you care to comment on it?
Yeah, the Labor Lyceum, it comes, a little bit of Jewish history here, that we had a strange blend of Jewish unions. In almost every city, it's the garment unions are dominated by Jews. We did not have a decent garment industry, partly because the air was so foul and filthy that you couldn't create fine, for example, dresses here. They get dirty, fine shirts. The only thing that was made in Pittsburgh was work clothes. And it wasn't particularly a Jewish industry. The Jewish industry was making cigars, bakeries, and some, what do we call it? A significant number of building trade members. But the Labor Lyceum was a merger of all the unions contributed money, particularly the stogie workers. And there are also gifts from unions outside. They created a building right next to Sheraton Villa, right across from the Miller School, a big brick building. And the lintel stayed for years on the side of the building, workers of the world unite.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Nothing to lose but your chains. And what it became was the site of, union meetings, Yiddish culture, the Yiddish school. But the problem was it didn't last very long. It opened in 1916 and it closes in 1930 with a vicious fight between the communists, the socialists, and the anarchists, which tore the union movement here apart.
So my grandfather's brother was an active socialist. He was a stogie maker.
Well, I can tell you, Bob, as an active socialist, he's part of the right wing of that labor movement.
That was my father, Bob.
One also
making the marsh wheeling stogies.
Stogies, right, which my father used to smoke. Yeah, exactly. And actually in the marsh wheeling, they left Pittsburgh to get away from the Union. We'll talk about that in the next thing. But I'd like to share one thing. The Ikes is this amazing. How many of us wouldn't be here if the Ikes hadn't saved our families? Okay, and the executive director was a man named Sidney Teller. Oh boy, from 1915, I guess, until the end of World War II. And Barbara Burston referred to him in her book as aloof. My father described him as sour. You'd see these pictures of him in the slums and the alleys of the Hill District. He was always pissed off, always angry. But he had brass balls. And I want to tell you one quick question, or quick story. There was a major 1919 steel strike. It was after Homestead, where the union tried to revive itself, the old amalgamated iron, steel, and tin workers. And it was absolutely across the country. And again, in those days, believe it or not, the mayor of the city of Pittsburgh forbade any meeting or any march involving the strike. Okay. Now, the Labor Lyceum, okay, respected that because they were afraid of being busted by the cops. So Sidney Teller assembles his board of the 15 most prominent German Jews from Rodef Shalom and one token Russian Jew. And he says, we're going to hold a meeting here for the strikers. He said, but what we're going to do is one night for the strikers and one day for the employers. They can all have their speakers and tell their thing. And somehow he convinced this group of blue bloods to do it. And they disobey the mayor and they invite the union speaker William Z. Foster, who actually later became head of the Communist Party in the United States. But they were concerned he was too radioactive. Instead, a second person came. They held a huge rally at the Ikes, okay, when nobody would touch it, okay? And that's something that, how can I say it, that for many people, it's a pity, you know, it's a pity. So many, my mother, for example, our mother, she's a little kid. She lived in that place. They came from Romania. She couldn't even speak English, okay? They literally, at Miller School, sat her down and put a Jewish girl next to her for 6 months to translate. Her world was the Ikes. She, you know, the M. Kaufman camp and papier mache and fashion. And she later became one of the first women buyers at Kaufman's. That's the first place where she learned about sewing and about a pattern. It was life for everybody.
She went to Emma Kaufman camp.
Emma Kaufman camp. And if you ever see Ken Love's movie, a large part of the portion is about relations of Blacks and Jews. And Frank Bolden, the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, the Black newspaper, what he says is about the Ikes, this Jewish organization, okay? He said they kept the Black community alive during the tuberculosis epidemic of the 30s. The visiting nurses, 30,000 visits to Blacks' homes. And in a time when, Blacks couldn't get into white YMCAs and community houses, they were not allowed to become members of the Ikes because only Jews could become members of the Ikes, but they could become program participants. What did that mean? As this one guy said in the film, it means we didn't have to, unlike the Jewish kids, we didn't have to pay for anything, okay? Because the Ikes was open to everybody. The door was always open. And what happens, again, a little bit, there's no time later to talk about this next week. What happens is the Ikes, as the neighborhood becomes less and less Jewish, the budget is going in almost entirely to the Black community. And there's all this agitation, what are you doing? Get the Ikes off the hill. And there's a great fight. And that's why it's not until 1956 that they do leave. But the Ikes insisted, the staff, that the visiting nurses had to stay. One thing I have for my next time, but you should really see it, there's a photograph in 1935. The staff is like 45 people, social workers, librarians, nutritionists, and you see them, mostly Jewish, some not. They came from a tradition of settlement work, social workers, and they brought such a feeling that even when I was just in J Drug, I mean, it's still, the Anna Heldman Center, eventually would collapse with lack of money, but it was still strong then. The Ikes tradition carried on. So when I was, working at J Drug, there's still the milk well, there's still the visiting nurses, all this activism. That institution can be proud of itself. And yet I don't think that, honestly, that one person in 25 walking into the Jewish Community Center at Forbes and Murray understands that's the child of the Ikes. And Kaufman money underwrote that too. So anyway, next question.
See if there are other questions.
Yes, next question.
Can I ask a question? Can you give a little bit, for people who didn't grow up in Pittsburgh, can you give a little bit more background about Ikes, like what it stands for, how it started?
It's the Irene Kaufman settlement. Now, it's given the Kaufman family, save an hour for themselves. They're a group of German Jews, remarkable people, remarkable for the good they did and maybe the harm they did to each other, fighting with relatives, okay? One of the Kaufman brothers who is allowed to stay in the store, most of them are booted out, like in 1913, given a lot of money to go away. Of the Kaufmans who can stay, it's, I guess I'm thinking it's probably Morris, I guess. No, Henry. His daughter is Irene Kaufman. And it's pretty clear that she kills herself when her father will not let her marry a Russian Jewish chauffeur, okay? And again, other stories, a German Jewish woman from Rodef Shalom had established the Columbian Council settlement first. It was women's classic actives and blue stocking activism. And when Kaufman comes with a fortune to create the Ikes, the women are pushed aside. But the plan is, this again, this for the next session, this gigantic building is built at 1835 Center Avenue, state of the art, like 6 or 7 stories high, okay? And it will go into the heart of the Jewish Hill. As we talk about this part, actually, I was going to talk about this tonight in the next section, that, you know, the fighting back and forth. But whatever you think of the German Jews, and they were arrogant, materialistic, and this and that, and condescending, I said there, in Isaiah 58, you know, the thing you read on Torah on Yom Kippur, part of the perfect fast is do not avoid avert your eyes from your blood and kin. And they certainly didn't. You know, all of these institutions, and the Ikes above all. So it's a professional social work operation that sees itself as Americanizing the Jews, at the same time dealing with Jewish and Italian mothers who have no sense of sanitation, okay, to teach people nutrition, to, again, the nurses, what are they fighting? It's tuberculosis and typhoid and scarlet fever, okay? And all of this stuff is done simultaneously. At the same time, the place is filled with Yiddish culture. And it has to deal, starting like in the 1930s, how do you deal with the fact that a neighborhood around you is turning black, whose people are as desperate as the Jews? And the way they deal with it is to open the doors. Okay, the first place that did it. And that will lead to the fight in the Jewish community, because the Federation of Jewish Philanthropies was giving such amounts of money to the Ikes, as was the Kaufman family, as were German Jews at Rodef Shalom, who regarded that as their charity. And the thing keeps growing. In 1929, an incredible athletic wing is put on, a massive auditorium. They sponsor basketball leagues, occupational training. They deal with help for the blind. Anything that can happen, the Ikes will do. And they're also the purveyor of last resort. It's like when everybody was afraid to help the steelworkers, Teller was there. And it is such an incredible standing. But what will happen to it, Eleanor, is this, that Jews will move away from it. They start in Oakland, the YMWHA, you know, the handsome building across the Cathedral of Learning. And it's understood that this is for the middle-class Jews of Squirrel Hill, respectable people, because the Ikes is overrun with black people. It's blacks and Jews together, and do you want to send your kid down there, and blah, 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 blah. And it bounced off Sidney Teller's back. It was like, go fuck yourself. And they just continued to program and program and program. But in the end, he leaves, and Sidney Lindenberg will come in, that's Sue's father. He's gonna have to fight that fight to keep the Ikes open. And ultimately they lose it. And they go to Squirrel Hill. And you know the building next to Squirrel Hill Theater that had the bowling alley in it? That was the Squirrel Hill Ikes, and on Forward Avenue. And they take all their money and they put everything at Forbes and Murray, and they move so far from their roots that it's like, it's nothing. The only thing in the Ikes is the old pictures on the wall. The spirit's completely gone of, well, whatever. Next. Sorry.
See if there are other
Other questions?
questions.
I think so.
I guess
Other
ask people to
other
speak
screens?
up so we can see it.
Yeah.
I know there are people on other screens, but I can't.
Yeah, we can't see there. Anyone on this screen would like to ask a question?
Anyone on screen two? Anyone on screen three?
Anybody?
My children, there was a bathhouse there that there was a well-known person who was teaching swimming lessons, and my children took swimming lessons, the bathhouse in
Right.
the Hill District.
Well, that's another story about it. There was an incredible natatorium and pool there. One of the two things is that, one, they always had bathhouses because people couldn't take a bath. That was one of the major attractions of the Ikes. But in terms of swimming, that was seen as one of the prime Americanizing sports. And the Ikes had great swimming teams. Nady Kaufman was the coach there. And they turned out generations of Pitt swimmers, particularly, getting scholarships to Pitt to swim. Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions or comments?
I just really appreciate that. The way that
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
That's Lydia.
Olivia.
I'm trying to phrase my question properly.
Okay.
Because I'd never heard about the kind of race relations you're talking about between white Jews and the Black community in the Hill. Sounds idyllic. Like
Well, it wasn't idyllic because the other side would be, of course, in 1968 there were the riots. Okay, the view would grow. It was idyllic in 1958, 59, 60, 61. But as the civil rights movement grows, I think there's greater consciousness of are the Jews exploiters? They're the landlords. They have the stores, et cetera, et cetera. They were such exploiters. My father couldn't afford to send me to college. It was what it involved was, in a sense, the Jews were there first, and the Blacks came later. It's repeated in other places where the Jews weren't the first group. But I can tell you, it depended who you were and how you treated people. And I'll tell you a story. Can anybody here that ever shot the Bankovits put up your hands? Okay, every hand goes up. You know, it's a famous company. Okay, live fish. And it's, again, the old Hill. It's midnight. My father's locked up the store. And we're walking over to Heldman Street, Overhill Street, which is where the Ike's is. There's a Black woman sitting on her porch. And live fish grew organically, storeroom by storeroom by storeroom. And Bernie Bankovitz had nowhere to park the 25 trucks. They're parked all over the hill, stinking in front of people's houses. So my father, we're getting into the house, and there's one of his big international trucks, you know, smelling. My father knew the woman. She was like a customer, Hattie, and said, "It's a disgrace the way Bernie parks his trucks all over the hill." You know what she says? There are a whole lot of, again, the phrase at the time, there are a whole lot of color guys working down there making $8 an hour. And he can park his trucks wherever he wants. And during the riot, many, you know, Jewish and Gentile stores were looted. Live fish was pretty much left alone. It was seen as a part of the community. And it was quite selective even again in some, my father would say, they wouldn't have touched us, I would hope. But some stores were hit, some stores were not. Cantor and Smaller wasn't touched because it had a good reputation. You know, it depended, but it wasn't idyllic. And certainly when you take if you asked me, obviously the riot, and it's something I avoided in this talk here. What would those people have said that came in all those times if their store had been burned down or they'd been attacked? It'd be hard to say. I remember for more people, in the Hill and elsewhere, the great, I think, split comes with, you know, Black power and basically the expulsion of Jews from the civil rights movement. The way Jews saw it, my mother, for example, certainly did, it was Goodman, Cheney, and Warner, and how can you say that we have no place? And it's difficult, you know, and I can say, no, I'm sorry, yeah, difficult. But I can tell you, I guess everything's by comparison. In comparison to how, let's say, for example, let's say in Homewood, how the Irish of Homewood reacted to the Black arrival in Homewood was a lot different than the Hill. Okay, and the sympathy that many Jews felt, most whites didn't. And many Jews felt a sense of betrayal in the riots and the treatment, because I can tell you, as the son of an exploitative, Jewish merchant in the Hill, drugstore, where everybody working there was Black, who served, Black people, delivered Black people. It's an example, okay? I delivered all over the Hill. I never was hassled. After the riot, this is after the riot, I was working for a summer job for the Health and Welfare Association, social welfare planning. And because I knew all about the Hill, if you remember, Freedom House Ambulance became the Pittsburgh EMTs. And they said, why don't you go up the Hill and ride the ambulances? And I did for 6 weeks after the riot. And what did I show up the first day? I show up, Jay, hey, shaking hands and everything else. And we miss you, we miss your father. Thank God your dad got out. And the one guy was really funny. The guy across the fireman was the bane of my father's existence. And he said, hope you checked it out. They totally destroyed firemen. I said, yeah, okay. But it's complex. It's just that I think that, and I really do mean this, that most Blacks felt that the only white who would give you a break was a Jew. Okay? But other questions?
The other thing, Rich, is about the birth of jazz in the Hill with the Crawford Grill.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And really, in the late 40s, early 50s, being Jewish, we were not afraid to go down there and go into the Crawford Grill. And
The hurricane, yeah, right.
Oh, yeah. When we first moved to Pittsburgh, the Lefkowitzes took us to listen to jazz in the Hill District.
Right. No, it was a great place. I commend to you a book called Smoketown about the Black Hill that is just outstanding. The politics, the sociology, the Courier. And a fascinating thing I would love to see would be, everybody here knows Teenie Harris, the great Black photographer who, the Courier. But I have seen a picture, because remember, you couldn't shoot the Hill without shooting Jews. They just were there. And the Courier, for example, was always, they rightly treating their advertisers. Does anybody on the call know the Soblowski family, the Basement's Garage? And okay, there's Steve Soblowski is a tax lawyer, an old friend. There's a picture of his dad, Lenny, from, I don't know, 1940. He always knew him as this kind of old guy, and he's this young, vigorous man in the brand new tow truck that they bought. Okay, and we just went nuts looking at it. And there are many, many, many more of them in the Teenie Harris archives about that should fish out, because they capture the Jewish Hill as well.
Do you want to check?
Somebody, I just heard a question.
Hello, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is David Fireman, and it was my great uncle Louis that was across the street from you.
Oh, well.
And Jack Fireman had the pharmacy as well.
Yes, that's the person who changed my father's life, unfortunately. I'm not sure his connection, is it cousin or something of the drugstore? But
it was my great, they were actually, he was my great uncle, and the drugstore was actually my uncle.
I can tell you that this beautiful, incredible drugstore emerged across the street, and J Drug then had to pick up its game.
Thank you so much for the great stories, though. You brought back a lot of memories, and I have that photograph that you shared.
I'll pass one other thing back to you about firemen and all the rest. That it was covered in the Post, because that a little bit. When the firemen opens this gorgeous store, my father has to get money to modernize. And my dad was a good businessman, and they at that point in 1950, 51, they were making money. And he dealt with Potter Bank, and probably older folks here remember Potter. It's part of predecessor of PNC. And he goes down to see the guy, deals with him, keeps getting the runaround. Won't give him the money, won't tell him why. And it's very, very, my father could be angry. And right in back of our store was an Italian gentleman named Mr. Tardio, Tardio, who was a barber and kind of a left-wing political guy. And my dad's telling Tardio that he can't get money for the store. And if we don't get money for the new fireman's going to put us in bankruptcy, because we look like we're some kind of Hill District shack, and he looks like it's Monroeville. Okay. So Tardio says, no problem. My kid works for Mellon Bank. And my father remembered a little kid coming to the fountain. So what do you need? Well, he's like a vice president, probably 500 vice presidents, but fine. My dad goes down to see him. And what he tells him is, Harry, I don't have to tell you, we're not allowed to lend in the third ward to anybody. I said, what do you mean? We cannot lend in the third ward. Anybody. Okay, it's called redlining. Okay, but he says, look, here's what I'll tell you. Every drugstore in Allegheny County is pulling out their fountains. If you contact your ice cream company, who's your ice cream company? He said, well, it's Menzie from the Keysport and Valley's their ice cream. He says, Menzie's good. If you'll contact them, you wait and see. They'll lend you the money for your new front. Oh, thank you. So my father calls them, gets not just the new front, he gets a new fountain, which allows us to compete with firemen, okay, from Menzie Dairy. So but that was the redlining. And in that aspect, it swept up a white man and a Jew. But you could see what the blacks were up against, in Pittsburgh, that no matter your credit, no matter what you did, your third ward, you're redlined, okay? And that was the truth. It really was. Yeah.
Rich, your cousin Larry.
Hey,
Larry.
Larry, I can't see you.
Where is it? Let's see.
Well, I can't see you either. I'm on my phone.
Oh, okay.
But I didn't hear you talk about the wonderful baked goods at Filner's from my aunt Sarah and Uncle.
No, you didn't. I talked about Mrs. Filner.
Okay.
Next section that you didn't talk about. I don't.
Oh no, I talked about Mrs. Filner.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Oh well, absolutely. I mean, well, again, the 43 photo doesn't do justice to it. Later on, Mrs. Filner puts on this beautiful Carrera front, but she was a very, very left-wing person, probably a communist. Her son was a communist who married Larry's aunt, Sarah Frischman.
Sarah.
Yeah, the key to any happiness is marrying a Frischman girl. Maybe not a Frischman boy, but a Frischman girl. And but you go over there, and I just loved her. She'd be there, and I could still see the two cases coming together in an L, and fantastic goods. But it was
that's where my mother and father met.
Well, that's right. This further story is Auntie Ann was working at the counter at Filner's, and Sam, Larry's father, was really content. He was almost a bachelor type, and combination of my mother and my grandmother Gelman practically walk him down to the store. Okay, and that's where the romance will begin. She's very a funny thing though. After my father died, we had Shiva on Whiteman Street, and nothing but people talking about the hill. Kizelinsky was a neighbor of Larry's on Darlington Road, Benny Kizelinsky, and they're talking and loving it, and fondly talking about Mrs. Filner, who, how could I say it? Money wasn't a prerequisite for getting anything from the bakery. You just needed food. And Benny is saying very warmly, remembering Mrs. Filner, her kindness and her wonder and the great food. And there was a fellow who was also had married a Brean. He was a big shot who owned a big lumber company in Pittsburgh. And what he said was disapprovingly, she gave away more bread than she ever sold. Disapprovingly. And oh, okay. She was like a tzaddik. She really was. She's also buried at Kessler Torah, and that's something we talk about later, next time. But my father always made a point of visiting her to put a stone on her grave. And I said to my father, this will come up later, we were Jews. I said, kind of surprised, Dad, when she was a real free thinker, almost kind of maybe an atheist. And there's, he said, yeah, it doesn't matter. She's a Jew. She was always a Jew. Didn't, but she, a remarkable person. Larry, do you remember the thumbprint cookies?
Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful stuff.
Fearman from the drugstore across the street.
Rich,
Was that Maury
Fearman? They lived above the store. For all those years that the store was there, they lived above it.
Right, exactly right. Yeah. Well, many of the Jewish merchants did. Dave Hausman, the butcher, did.
Yeah.
And there were, it's funny, the hill was not all black. there were people everywhere. An example, is Helen Oringer on the call still?
Yeah, I saw her.
Well, Helen lives on.
I'm still
Hey,
here.
Helen, in fact, you can tell the story if you want, Helen, about Dr. Goldblum's mother.
Yeah, I just remember him talking about worrying about her staying there and not wanting to move out.
Yeah, this is Dr. Goldblum from Inverness. His mother lived on Dinwiddie Street, which was a beautiful street. He couldn't get her off the hill. So that, I guess into the 70s, yet she's still living there. And there were many people like that, Jews and non-Jews, who simply wouldn't leave. And particularly the place that really stayed intact was up on Cliff Street, where the Syrians were living. That didn't bother them in the slightest, they continued to stay. Yep.
Hey, Rich.
And you need to leave.
Oh.
Hey, Rich, it's Bill.
Yeah. I can't say.
Where?
Yeah, can you hear me? It's Bill Klingensmith.
Oh, hey, Bill.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, just for the group, I think we want to try to wrap this up.
Sure.
We want to save lots for your next discussion, which will be on November the 17th.
Right.
So what I'd suggest is, do you have any kind of closing comments you want to do to summarize your talk tonight? And
I guess, yeah. Oh, sure.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I guess what I'd say is this: is that tonight was meant to lay the basis for the 5 substantive things of we were Jews, they worked, et cetera. But you have to understand to understand the Hill, you cannot forget the poverty. That was the dominant thing about it. And I was always struck when people showed you, the old neighborhood. The Markisons, Karen's family, is like Strawberry Mansion in South Philadelphia, the row houses. The row houses were so much better than the Hill District. You can see it wasn't like that. The row houses were built as really solid worker or middle class housing. Nothing in the Hill was built for wealthy people. It was built for poor workers, and it was very old, and the Jews couldn't make a living. And the thing that saved the Hill, it really was this, that it was based on a horribly exploitive industry. We'll talk about that next time, the stogie industry, which not only didn't pay, but it killed you with tuberculosis, okay? And the longer people remained proletarians, the more desperate they were, because the place was inherently filthy and bad. You couldn't take these homes and make it into a decent neighborhood. And it was only when the Jews transitioned out of being workers and into trade, into working in wholesale, stores, and then into professions, that they were allowed to prosper. An example, I'm saying this is it's the key thing about the Hill is the poverty, number one, and number two, the experience of this ethnic neighborhood turning into an African American neighborhood. And I know that there's this, how can I say, a feeling, how to say it, the Jews did not run from the blacks, in the sense that really for about 35 or 40 years, they overlapped with the Black community. What they ran from was the pictures you saw. It was a kind of place that just assaulted the soul because it was so bad. And when you combine it with the, how can I say it? They were surrounded also by enemies. One of the things I try to convey with the geography, all around them were Jews, groups of Christians, particularly Poles, Irish, Lithuanians, who really hated them, didn't like them. And the Hill had this kind of bunker mentality. And part of some camaraderie between blacks and Jews is they were common enemies of the same people. But it was not a good place to live. It just really wasn't.
Yeah. Good place to stop.
A good place to stop.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Rich. Really amazing.
Right. And we'll pick up next time, kind of short 5 things and get you through it.
Can you discuss
the base?
Wonderful. And thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Everyone tonight, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I love the personal stories. That made such a difference.
Right.
Thanks, Rich.
Same link.
Thanks, Rich.
third
Bye.
It's
Bye,
great.
Rich.
Thank you, wonderful.
Before you all go, though,
Thank you.
it's so great to have the Breens and Gelmans together again, even just in front of me. That's it's like a bar mitzvah.